Okay, this is another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is BSL, aka Beasel. It's the same shit basically, and he's a very old school Counter-Strike player. So actually, I want to start in the old school for obvious reasons, but I think I have a different way of going about it because there's a tournament which means absolutely nothing to almost everyone who's watching this interview now. Literally, even people from this era do not remember this tournament. They won't know what I'm talking about. But it's actually quite significant because in some kind of a roundabout way, it is how you got your start in the top end of the competitive scene. But as far as I know, there's some weird detail. Like I believe you did not actually play at this tournament. So the tournament I'm referring to was the tournament which was the breakout tournament for Element, some of these play Damien, etc., which was where they were in a team. It was your team, Meredia, and it was a tournament called GameSphere, and it was in your native Norway. And the reason why this tournament was actually very interesting is because it's a rare example of a small land no one will remember, which people won't know, actually had a massive impact on a bunch of different teams. Because what happened was, it was a tournament, I think, in the spring of 2002, and it actually ended up having an impact on a bunch of world-class teams and this team that you took, which was somewhat unknown at the time. And what happened was, after the big CPL, where NIP won, but it was the NIP that just for that one tournament had Vestlin standing in, they went back to the old NIP lineup where they got Executor back and they had like the original lineup that everyone remembers from 2001. And so Vestlin, who was considered a top player, in-game leader, was like trying out for a bunch of different teams. And he was trying to figure which is he going to join. And so the two top Swedish teams he had the option between was there was the Game Online team, which was obviously very good and had been top placing at many CPLs. And then there was the Nordic division team, which was like kind of like the players team, you know, all the top players said they were very good. They just hadn't been to that many of the huge tournaments. And so as he was deciding between the two, he decided to go with Game Online to this tournament in Norway. And the reason everyone went to this tournament in Norway is they claimed that the first place was like $10,000 or something. Now, in the end, it all ended up being bullshit. It was like you got like some headsets worth 10,000 or some nonsense like that. But also at this tournament, there was the best Norwegian team, which is a team called Massive Attack, who had placed fourth at the last big CPL. And actually doing badly at this tournament, I believe, is one of the elements that made Dark leave this team, who was the star player, and he actually initially went over to Nordic Division. So you can see how all these different elements conspire to happen, which actually changed a bunch of people's careers, because at this tournament, we had basically two of the top four teams in the world, but they all lost to this Norwegian team called Meredia, who, okay, maybe a few people in the top scene knew them from like the odd scrim or something, but they were not a top team. They hadn't really played any big competitions. Now, what's bizarre about that is people know that team because it launched Element's career, and very quickly after that, obviously he was a very young player, but kind of a prodigy. He was picked up by Game Online, went on to big things, but it was basically your team, but you didn't play in that particular tournament or something, right?
Well, I'm smiling because your research is, as always, very good. And I'm also smiling because what you're saying is essentially true. So my breakout performance was one where I didn't participate, and that's quite unique, I think. The thing about Meredia was that was basically me and Element starting the team together. We sort of sat on these practice channels whining because the only Norwegian top team at the time, Massive Attack, they didn't want to take Element because he was 15 years old and kind of immature at the time. And they didn't want to take me because I wasn't very good. And he couldn't get on any of the Swedish teams either. And that was mostly because of a spat that he had with Executor, and one that followed them through their careers, essentially. So we sort of just made a team with some up-and-coming young Norwegian kids, and went to LAN in a really rural part of Norway that spring earlier, and won that easily. But I had a backpacking trip through the States with some of my friends that I had paid for, and everything before this happened. So I was actually standing on at Times Square in New York, I think reading gamers.new at that time. And it said that we had won the tournament in GameSphere. And that was obviously a huge deal because, as you say, there were some of the top Swedish players at the time who participated. And way back then, I mean, Executor, he was sort of like an anomaly in the Norwegian scene. He never really took part in the Norwegian scene in 2001 and 2002 because he was on a different level. He was a world-class player. So for a Norwegian team of essentially unknown players to beat a team with Vestlandet was a huge deal. And as you said, it kind of launched Element into his superstar career. And I think he quit the team a couple of months later. Couldn't blame him at all because he went to Game Online and got a salary and sponsorship and whatnot. But that win sort of gave meredia a name internationally. So we got to go to LAN Arena 7, I think,
yes,
in Paris, which was essentially the predecessor to ESWC.
Yes.
And we got in our first international tournament, and it sort of just went on from there, really. So it's it's kind of a strange launching story, I guess.
So the interesting thing was this team, which obviously, thanks to sponsorship from, I think it was called Cafe Spacebar, right? It became Team Spacebar, which is basically the same squad but without Element. This squad, one of the ways to describe it, okay, is that basically after this, most of the squad kind of left, and famously you were kicked out of it and went and formed Eolithic with Element, who returned because, if, as you'll probably find out during this interview, Element does whatever the fuck Element wants, and he's kind of like a character in a soap opera who's not in every episode, but every time he comes in, you know, shit's going to go down. So anyway, basically, you had this lineup before, and with a couple of different players, like I think you took in Starwatch, who was from no, actually it was Mandatory, was it? Which player was it from Massive Attack did you take in a Spacebar for the summer?
That was Starwatch. We needed a stand-in there because we had some player leave at the end there.
Because the thing is, this team that you had, like you said, you went to LAN Arena, you went to the CPL summer event. It was actually a pretty decent team, and obviously the core of it did go on to become Eolithic. I know at this point in time, when that all broke up, is when you then went and you were obviously in Brazil, and you had that whole adventure. Were you hard done by in this first period in Norway? Like, did people just not respect you as a leader or something? Why did this squad not have more success, and why were you kind of eliminated from it?
Well, what happened there was after we went to LAN Arena, which was our first international tournament, we lost all our games and were sent home essentially 3-0. And we picked up the sponsor from my city, which was a LAN house, a net cafe, run by a bunch of 30-year-olds who were just, I don't know, they were just enjoying themselves with gaming and internet culture, and started that LAN cafe. And they sort of all chipped in to send us to Dallas. That's where we brought Starwatch. And at that tournament, we were doing quite decently, I'd say, for a CPL first timer at that point. We lost to Game Online and Element, who would go on to place second, I think, at that tournament.
Yes.
And I can't remember who we lost to in the end.
Gamers X, which was like Steel and Trigger. It was like an American team, and a Method. And it was. What's funny is you actually lost on Mill, if you remember that one that only the Americans played, and they won an overtime game.
And I was really close too.
Yes, it was overtime, I believe.
That was terrible. Oh, yeah, you're right. So we went back, and for us, the event was sort of a huge success, and it was a huge success for the LAN house as well, because they had a lot of people come in to watch the event on HLTV. And remember, this was in 2002, so it's like in the dark ages. But what happened back then is certainly you see it nowadays as well, but with contracts and lots more money, it's not as common. But we had some drama. So what happened was that another one of the players, his name was Knoxville, he wanted me out and asked around with some of the other players, and then they all agreed that they wanted me out of the team. And they went to the owners of this LAN house and said that. And what they basically said was that, okay, without Jonas, there is no sponsorship.
Yes.
And I don't really know why that was. It's not like I knew them from before, but I guess I was, I don't know, older, possibly more mature. I don't know. But anyway, they wound up leaving, all of them, and some of them formed Eolithic. Knoxville went on to kick one or two of the others as well before landing that Eolithic lineup that did very, very well in some lower level tournaments there before going to Dallas and crashing out famously against Sunman, the shot heard around the world for those who are really, really old school. And yeah, at that time I was really dejected by the whole thing because I don't know, I thought that I was going to try and act like a professional person in all of it, and I basically got told that I wasn't good enough, and I felt that it wasn't true. I felt I was on the level, and it was some sort of, I don't know, strange personality thing. But fine, whatever. I took in 4 new players, and we went to CPL Oslo, which Eolithic wound up winning in an incredibly impressive fashion. And my new lineup, which we've had it for 1 or 2 months before the event, we did poorly. I think we placed 13th through 30th. This was a double elimination system. So, and I was also really disappointed with how some of the players performed, and in my mind, there was no future to that team. So I basically just said to the owners of that LAN house that we need to break this team up because you guys don't have a lot of money, and I don't want you wasting it on a team that can't produce results. And they said, okay, that's fine. If you want to continue your career, you can sit here with your computer, and we'll always support you. And at that time, I didn't have a job. I just started my university studies. So I sat there and worked on my game, essentially. My biggest problem back then was the aim. I didn't have a background from any FPS game. I hadn't played Quake. I was used to playing on a computer with really low FPS. So my aim was pretty bad, and that's why sort of they coined a term for me in Norway, which was more or less a play on the famous spray of Heaton, which he was really good at.
Sure.
So they just called it BSL spray because it was sort of a running joke because I would spray a lot and somehow I'd make it work. But I worked a lot on my aim that fall and made a frag movie, one of the first frag movies, I guess, after the famous Frag or Die.
Yes.
And I just called it BSL from the block after the J-Lo hit that fall. And sort of just went on with my life, having fun. And then I went to the next big thing for me. I mean, after seeing Eolithic crash out of CPL Winter, which obviously was fun for me, I went to Brazil for a backpacking trip. And that's sort of how the whole next adventure of my career started.
Sure. So actually, one thing I wanted to kind of draw a lot of these elements in with the stuff you did outside of the game, because obviously some of the other stories aren't really relevant to esports. Already in the interview, in the span of one question and one answer, people have already found out that you took 2 backpacking trips to various different locations around the world. And this is something that throughout your life continued on. So later on, I remember you telling me that you took that, like, what's it called, like the fucking Trans-Siberian Express or something. You know the one out that movie where they made it? Like, you actually went on that way. You have to go for like 2 days or something, and the woman like smashes the shit off the end of the thing with a hammer or something because it's all frozen on. Like, how did you try? What was the logic here between trying to be professional gamer, which, by the way, at that time especially, is a job where you just sit in a dark room for 16 hours a day, not talking to a human except through a keyboard, but at the same time trying to like traverse the globe? What was the logic in this sort of bizarre lifestyle?
Well, there was no logic. I sort of fell into Counter-Strike just prior to doing my mandatory military service in Norway. And I instantly found the game interesting. I had stopped playing football. I played football all through high school. So I was essentially 18 years old when I started playing, which kind of sounds ridiculous today, right? And did my military service, and I got really sick with something called mononucleosis. And that sort of ended, I wouldn't say my football career. It's not that I would have gone on to play professionally or anything, but I couldn't play football. And I was sitting at home a lot, sort of sulking. And then this friend of mine brought me to a LAN house where I started playing Counter-Strike. And instantly I found it very entertaining and sort of like a substitute for football because it was a team sport and everything. And just very short while after that, I discovered through some internet sites that people were actually getting paid to fly around the world and compete. So for me, Counter-Strike married 2 interests of mine, one being competitive in team-based sports, and the other being able to travel. I've always been a traveler. Grew up in a family that went and lived in Brazil in 1986 when I was 4 and 5 years old. So I've always kind of had that travel bug. And I thought to myself, hey, I'm going to spend 1 year here after the military service is done and see if I can get good enough to be able to fly around doing this stuff. And if I'm not good enough within a year, I'll drop the whole thing and just go all in on my university education. And I would say, luckily for me, I managed to get on that flight to Paris and to CPL Dallas the next summer. So that's kind of the background on why all of these travels keep happening. And that's sort of something that just has been with me throughout my life. And when I was in that dejected state after the whole Spacebar Eolithic thing happened, I thought, hey, let me just get my mind off some things and talk to some of my friends who also like to travel. And we went to Brazil on this backpacking trip. And you're absolutely correct about taking that train through Siberia. That takes actually 7 days if you do it. If you do it all in once. I think we spent 3 weeks at it because we got off the train and visited cities throughout Siberia and China as we went along. But it's a really great adventure.
Okay, so obviously, here's the funny part, right? Some people will know the next part of the story because actually, I mean, funnily enough, because of the rise of Brazilian Counter-Strike and CSGO, I've seen that some people, I believe it was like the ESPN Brazilian site, did a story where they kind of recounted this and drew the threads back to when you went to Brazil. Because if you say to someone, you then went to Brazil, it's going to sound like, right, you took a year off or something. Well, almost immediately when you got there, you were like the Godfather style. They just dragged you back into Counter-Strike, didn't you? Because you started to play with the team that obviously was MiBR, which actually had only, I think, very briefly been created at that point in time. They used to have a different team before then. And what's interesting about this story is, okay, it's not like in a movie where in the movie, you'd train with the team and then while you're actually there, you'd win the tournament or something like that. But it's actually clear to me that there's a term, I call it the hangover effect, right? Which I think a lot of people don't understand in Counter-Strike. Because obviously, when you have a hangover, right, technically, the alcohol isn't affecting you anymore. It was out your system hours and hours ago, the night before, but you still feel the effects of the fact that you had the alcohol in you the day before. And I've noticed with in-game leaders, you get this. It's why sometimes you get teams who kick an in-game leader, and for the first 2 or 3 tournaments afterwards, they still look really good, and people think, he obviously didn't do anything. And it's like, no, let's wait 2 months into the team, and let's see what happens then. Because then when the team crashes, you find out, guess what, they could still do a lot of the tactics he was telling them before, or they still had the system he put in place. So even though when you went and you played with this Brazilian team, and at the time Brazilian teams weren't very good, like they used to go to CPLs and basically come last place or something around there, they were never having legit results. Around the time you joined the teams, they started to show some better results, like they could maybe come like top 16 or something, which, by the way, for tournaments we're talking about, that's a big deal, actually. 128 teams might go to a CPL, and there'd be good North American teams who didn't place top 16. It was a very competitive tournament. So even though in the time you were there, they never had the placings, obviously it was actually the next CPL Winter, the one actually that you obviously go to later with NOA, where they kind of had their first big result, and they did get, I think it was like 6th or 7th place or something, a pretty good result, So what impact did you actually have on the Brazilian teams, and what was the setup there? Were you just playing with them initially? Did it go like tournament by tournament? What was it like?
That's also another crazy story. Let's just go to the start first. I was sitting on the beach in Rio de Janeiro with my friends, and we would go at the end of the day where we go up to shower and everything before food or whatever. We would stop at a LAN house to check our email, and I would check SoGame, which was basically the Facebook of gaming back then. Yes. And I had a message from a Brazilian guy who said that he'd seen on SoGame, I guess, that I was in Brazil, and he told me that he was a manager of the best Brazilian team, who I hadn't heard about them before. I mean, I'd heard about G3X because I think with Team Spacebar, we actually beat them at the CPL summer that we played in. So that was kind of my first run-in with Brazilian CS, and they had always crazy skills, even the year before, but they were disorganized and they wouldn't play tactically and whatnot. So this guy, he said he was the manager of the rival team of G3X, because G3X had always been the staple of Brazilian CS up to that point. And he'd seen the movie BSL from the Block. And he asked if I wanted to come to their LAN house and see them practice, because in Brazil at this point, they couldn't play online. The internet was bad, so they had to arrange to go into a LAN cafe, 2 teams or more teams to be able to practice. So I said, okay, I'll go. I can be a sociable person and meet these guys playing CS. It's fun to watch different cultures, all of that stuff. And when I got there, the guys were super nice, and we had a conversation and everything, and they were sitting down to play. And then this one thing happened. Again, it's kind of random, but life is random. And I hope the Brazilian people who are watching this will forgive me. But they were 5 players, and one of them was late, as a lot of Brazilians often are, in my experience. So they asked me if I would mind filling in for him. Yeah. And I sat down and played. Obviously, I couldn't speak a word of Portuguese, but they basically said, okay, cover left side. And I did that and tried with some English, tried talking some Norwegian. And we had a good time, because obviously these guys were so much better than the other team. So we won the practice sessions quite easily. And the next day I got a call, and this time from the manager, I guess, of the manager. And he said, hey, this guy, the guy that was late, he's not meshing too well with the team. We don't really like him. And we're going to the Latin American Championships in Peru in a month. Would you like to play for us there officially? And I thought, wow, that sounds strange, but why not? So I said, okay, I'll do that. I have 2 weeks left of my Brazilian vacation, and then I can go back home to Norway for a couple of days and then fly back down to Peru. And they agreed, and we went on a boot camp together for 1 or 2 weeks there, and that was it. And then we went to Peru and won that tournament. So that's quite exotic, actually. I think I'm going to be the only Norwegian esports player to be crowned Latin American champion. But I am, and I think we won $3,000 or something. It's a really nice tournament. Got to hang out in Lima, which is a beautiful city, and started to build a relationship with my teammates. And these guys were all super nice and tried helping me to learn the different names on the maps in Portuguese. And again, the day after that tournament concluded, the manager's manager called me and he said, hey, would you like to move to Rio and play with us full time? And then I had to have like a serious discussion with myself if I wanted to do that. And in the end, I figured, hey, this is a huge adventure that I'm getting to partake in because of Counter-Strike, and why not? So I told my parents I'd be moving to Brazil, and both of them were like, really? But at that time I was 22, right? So what can you do? And off I went, and we started practicing. And these guys, I mean, I had a lot of good times and moments in my active career, and I've had so much fun in esports after that. But I think those 4 or 5 months in Brazil, they were just amazing. Obviously, the weather down there is perfect, the living conditions, and also I had a salary for the first time, and everything worked. Teammates, really nice, and they were really sort of eager to learn. All of them were super, super skilled, but they sort of lacked a little bit in the tactical, and I'd say they lacked in being disciplined while you play. So these were the kind of things that I was good at. So I think that I got to transition some of those things into their skill set and also into their thinking. And we went to ESWC and CPL Dallas, and I think we placed, at least at ESWC, we placed 9th. And in Dallas, I think we had the 13th placement. And after that, I was offered a 1-year contract, which I turned down because I was missing my girlfriend in Norway at that time. And from my point of view, that's sort of the only mistake. The only thing I regret in my playing career is turning down that contract. And that's basically because at that point I had gotten proficient in Portuguese, not just Counter-Strike Portuguese, but in regular Portuguese. And had I stayed there for another year, I would have kept the Portuguese language with me throughout my life. But since I turned it down, saying that, hey, I miss my girlfriend, I need to go back to Norway, I only have like broken Portuguese, so it's not really something that I can use on a daily basis and stuff like that. And that's kind of sad, I think. But overall, super great time. Very professional organization behind the Brazilian team, and very, very good teammates. The fans down there are amazing, and it was just a great, great time.
So after this, you had another like quite bizarre but fortuitous, well, just opportunity where back in Norway, they'd had Eolithic and they'd gone through a bunch of different lineups, like kind of perfecting it, getting the best one. But then eventually, a similar storyline, Element left. I mean, this time, I can't really blame him because they had difficulties with sponsors and stuff. And he did at the time get an offer to go to SK Gaming, who obviously was like the number one team in the world and had all the, the CPL champions, etc. And so they went off and they made a very dominant, very successful team. And then you had this bizarre scenario where basically there was actually, funnily enough, the team I referred to before, Gamers X. This was I believe a chain of LAN cafes in, I think it was Southern California, and the people who were behind that, for whatever reason, at this point in time, around the late summer of 2003, decided to invest in teams. And beyond just having a team to represent the cafe, they actually did 2 teams. They got Adrenaline, which was Vestland's team, which was a very good team at the time. They got them over, and then they made this second team, which initially no one knew what it was called. It was just going to be some experimental team. And it was this one where people will now remember it was NOA. So it was it was Nikon, it was Knoxville, 3 Norwegians, and then it was shaGuar from Canada, and it was Method, who actually had been in the original GX teams, and obviously is a native of, I believe, Southern California. I think he's from California somewhere. Yeah. And so this is obviously a very weird team, especially at that point in time. No one's ever made a team where they try and get top NA players, some European players, put them together, and obviously, while in theory you could live there for a few months, it's not like you're permanently living in the US. There's no visas involved in this scenario. It's kind of it's an experiment. You're just seeing what will happen. Now, in this setting, I remember when I did my reflections with shaGuar, I think it was last year, all the stories he tells about that point in time is like, it wasn't what he thought it was going to be. Like, you get there and you just kind of all rammed in one room and stuff, and you don't really have money. And it seems like it was a very weird scenario. So while I want to know, yes, about the experience and what it was like and how you got to this crazy placing where it looked like things were going terribly, but then obviously you came second at the CPL, which was the big major and was a very stacked event. Yes, I want to know all that. But first, what I'd like to actually know is, why go and play with Knoxville? Like, this is the guy who kicked you out of your team. This is the guy who fucked you over, right? Are you just a very forgiving guy? I don't know if you know me, but I kind of hold grudges, BSL. I'm not as easy to let things go.
Yeah, why did that happen? First of all, I mean, like you said, this is such a crazy story, right? So it all began at ESWC that summer when I was there with MiBR, and we lost to Gamers X. And Gamers X, they were there with their manager, which was the guy that owned all the LAN cafes. And then he had, I don't know, he had a sidekick manager there for some reason. And he was pretty drunk at one of the parties. And he came over to me and we started talking. And he said, "Hey, it's cool that you're there with all the Brazilians. How's that working?" And I told him about the lifestyle of travel and going around the world and visiting with different cultures and whatnot. And he said, "Hey, that's cool. I want to build a team in America next to this whole Gamers X thing, which will happen with some Scandinavian players, by the way." So he just told me that he wanted his own team and he wanted me to run it. And I was like, okay, this guy's drunk. He's full of shit.
Okay.
And I didn't think about it for a second. But then when I got home from Brazil 1.5 months later, my phone rang randomly. And there's this guy and he says, "So are you ready to come to LA now and build this team?" And I said, yeah, why not? Because what had happened in the interim was I got home because I missed my girlfriend. And after some short weeks, I figured out that I didn't want to be together with that one. So we broke up and I was looking for a new team. And this is, sorry for being long here in the answers, but this story just kind of gets crazier and crazier by the minute. I know where
this one's going, but keep going.
Yeah,
the betrayal of SOA.
Yeah, so I have to apologize in advance to all the Danish people who are listening or watching this. But I was offered a captainship with SOA, which was the biggest Danish brand in esports at that time, and they were legacy back in 2003. They were a legacy organization in esports, and they had played in at the CPL Dallas several times, were the sort of the staple of the Danish scene at that point. And then they had sort of broken from where they were and were looking to rebuild. And they got me in the team, and I said, yeah, I can play with you guys from Norway, go to Denmark for all the different tournaments. And I was just sort of getting in the groove there. And so I went to I think it was a WCG qualifier in Copenhagen, and was the first event with the team. Super nice guys, but in the end, after a very disappointing result, I ended up kicking 2 of the players, which also were the fan favorites of that organization. And then a week later, I left for LA, and this wasn't. It wasn't on purpose, but sort of the call came in, and I had to make a decision quite fast. And SOA were let down by me leaving. And to this day, I'm obviously sorry about that. And it's kind of like a running joke in the old school Danish scene that I destroyed SOA and all of that stuff. But I came over to America, and this guy, he said, we have all of this money. You can get a salary here of $1,500 a month, which was huge back then. And he said, but basically you can get whoever you want to build a team. And went through some of the players, local players, all of which would rise to fame on their own a year or 2 later with Rival. But they weren't good enough at that time to build a world-class team. Okay. So the only guy that was good enough was Method, and he was obviously world-class. So we had to look for teammates, and I'd come to know shaGuar that summer at CPL, and I was sort of trying to actively to get him to come, but it was difficult because he was young and he was in school and all of that, and I needed 2 players, and Eolithic just sort of broke up more or less at that point. And the only players that were available from there were Nikon, which I knew was a good guy, and Knoxville, which obviously I had some troubled history with. But we talked, and we sort of decided that we'd try to make this work, because everybody was looking for a team, right? Everybody was looking to get back among the best in the world. So it was sort of like an agreement where we thought that we'd try this out and see if we can make it happen. And I asked the manager guy, and he said, yeah, sure, we can bring them over from Norway, just have them book their own flights and they can get reimbursed later. This is funny, I'm going to come back to this. And then we talked shaGuar into coming, and I actually had to call him and call his mom, I think, and tell him about the team and all the plans that the manager had and all the budgets and all that stuff. So shaGuar also flew over from Canada, and there we were, 5 very randomly picked together guys, a Canadian, 3 Norwegians, and a local guy from California. And we came up with this name NOA, which doesn't stand for anything. It's just something we came up with because we had to submit it for a qualifier that we were attending, and we didn't have a name. Okay. And within a week or 2, we started seeing signs of that the manager guy was fucking us over, because, like I said, I had my first salary, but we didn't get any of the, well, we were promised headsets, we were promised an apartment, we were promised a car, and what we ended up with was, well, he gave us his piece of shit car to use to get to and from practice, and me and the Norwegians, we were living in the basement of his in-laws' house, I think, and the in-laws, they were kind of well off. So he and his wife lived there as well, and we lived in the basement because that was the only place we could sleep. And at this time, the story gets even crazier, because the Swedish guys with Veslan, which had placed second, I think, at ESWC that summer. No,
they won it. It was CPL they were second at.
That's right. Correct. So they were obviously flying high off of those performances, and they were giving everything. They had this nice apartment, they had cars, they had everything, because the other guy, the Gamers X guy, he was also well off because he had won the lottery or some strange stuff. So he was pouring money into them. So they had basically everything they needed, and we were like roughing it pretty much to just get by. And I remember calling my mom and saying that just go into my room and take my computer, my TV, all my videos, DVDs, and sell everything, because I need money to sustain myself while we are here, and I need money to go to CPL Dallas, because that was sort of like the only thing that we could do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we could go back because our plane tickets were later or whatever, and this was something that we wanted to see it through, even though we were losing in practice so bad against the Swedes and everything. So everything was sort of stacked against us at that point. I mean, we had no money. We were living in some guy's basement, driving a piece of shit car that nearly broke down every other day, and we were losing all our practice games. And I had to sell my personal property to be able to even go to CPL Dallas. And we went, and was just to sort of underline how bad everything was. We received seed 17. No, 27.
32, I believe. 32 or something mental. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's 27.
Okay, could be.
Which means we would face the best teams at every turn, right? And we did, but we beat them all for some strange reason. I mean, everything, all of the practice, all of the anger and all of the hatred in the situation sort of came together in that tournament, and we sort of just blasted everybody, save for SK, which beat us in the winners bracket final. And I still can remember though the match before that was playing Veslan and those guys.
Yeah.
And being Swedes and the whole rivalry between Norway and Sweden, they would trash talk in advance, saying, "Hey, we beat you in all the practice games, and now we're gonna destroy you completely here and send you home." Yada 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 yada. And then this was back in Max Rounds 12, and we beat them 13-2, I think, on Nuke, which was one of their best maps as well. Yeah. So it was really satisfying. And we also took down a team with Hyper, which was the up and coming team from Sweden, with Wilden, who would go on to captain SK later. And also we broke Mouse Sports in the loser bracket final. So we basically beat every team in the world that had some kind of championship medal, but we lost to SK in the end, and that was fine because they were better than us in both of those games. And I think we won $21,000, and that was one of the rare occasions where CPL actually paid out their prize money. So we more or less got back the money that we were supposedly owed in salaries while we were there.
Okay. So the bizarre thing about this story, right? I mean, this really does kind of speak to what esports used to be like. Yeah. Because everyone should expect that the story now goes, yeah, well, of course you left NOA because the conditions were really bad and, you had to go back to... No. Because he just finished second in CPL, he wanted to stay in the team. This is what esports was like back then. But as will remain a trend that you will all appreciate in this interview, believe it or not, that Knoxville guy kicked BSL again, and you won't believe who he went and got. Element. Yeah. Can you believe it? The Norwegian scene's a ridiculous soap opera, isn't it? Right? When this move happened, I remember you even said, you were very magnanimous. You did say, obviously, I don't want to be kicked, but I have to acknowledge he is the better player than me, and he's obviously was in the best team in the world at the time, so you get value from damaging your rivals as well. But it has to sting when you have a fantastic result, and in fact, actually famously, I remember you used to play the Nuke ramp room on CT side with Knoxville, so it was even like the guy who you were both doing really well on the map that had gotten you those victories. It has to sting when they fuck you over again like that, though, right?
Oh, yeah, extremely. I mean, it was very, very bad. And I remember, I don't know, I didn't really believe that it was happening because it was, who would do that, right? And even after coming in second in the most prestigious, most difficult tournament of all time up to that point, who would do that? And I even played really well at the tournament as well. I think I was head on the scoreboard for 3 out of the 4 last matches, and that was kind of rare for me because I used to be an in-game leader. I wasn't really that well off with aim and all of that stuff, so I played off of smarts and strats and discipline. But yeah, I really had a good tournament, and to this day I don't really understand why he would go that route, and I can't really understand why the people in the team would think that would be okay as well. But like I said, obviously Element was a much better player than me.
Sure.
But what I was unsure of was how that team would mesh, because that's kind of the X factor with esports that a lot of people don't understand. You were sort of touching upon it there when you said that you have this period, right, with a hangover and all of that stuff where everything seems fine for a while, and then it starts going south because you have no in-game leader. And what I was good at making groups work and making groups perform, and that happened to NOA as well. After they kicked me, they had the worst results ever, and they had very, very good financial backing. for the next tournaments. I mean, they spent the next summer in 2004 at a boot camp in LA, and they came in 32nd at ESWC, and I think they also came in 32nd at CPL.
Yeah, they did pretty badly.
So it wasn't that I felt vindicated by that, not by a long shot, but I mean, for me, it was just baffling to me that would happen after I had the best professional results of my life. But at that point, I thought I made a bad choice as well. Well, I wouldn't say a bad choice after that. I mean, I went to Team AMD Gamer, which was a UK-based team, they had really good sponsorship and everything. So I guess more or less everything were stacked up for us to become a good team. But that's the only time in my career where I wasn't able to make the teamwork. And that was sort of on me, because I was the in-game leader. I was the established international superstar, whatever you want to call it, right? And that team turned out really badly. So yeah. Even though I could sit there from afar and look at NOA and see how they failed without me, I was still failing with the UK team. So there was no pleasure in it. It was just shit. Like you said, it was esports way back then, and it was just sad.
Okay, so a question I have then is, okay, right, obviously, for whatever reason, Knoxville and in their own way, Element and some of the others, either didn't respect you, or, I mean, it's hard to imagine it was anything personal, right? Because I don't think there's anything personal involved in it, was there?
Well, the only issue or point where this has happened has been with this Knoxville guy, and I don't really know what the problem is. I mean, I've always been nice with him. I also took him into Meredia and Team Spacebar. He was a manager at that time, playing for a Norwegian team called ZX9, and gave him a chance, and he became a good player in his own right for a time. And nope, I can't understand it. Maybe he had, for some reason, didn't like me. But I certainly didn't have any ill will towards him until the end of this NOA thing, which I think was just really, really bad. But he was very good at convincing people. Yeah. So he convinced shaGuar and Method and Nikon to kick me back then, and several of them have apologized later for how that turned out, and that's fine. Like I said, I don't want to go through life holding those kinds of grudges, but obviously I wouldn't give Knoxville a third chance.
Okay, so one of the bizarre things is, like, in the Norwegian scene, these two players, Knoxville and Element, in their own different ways, did really wreak havoc. Like, Knoxville kicked a bunch of people over and over again, and then Element obviously I don't blame him as much. He just chose to leave and join different teams, so he just was a little bit selfish internally, But aside from them, it felt like everyone else in the scene was pretty reasonable. It was like Nikon's a very chilled out guy. That Damien guy wasn't exactly super vocal, he was just a guy who liked to play. Obviously, Executor was kind of the veteran of the scene and, steered clear of a lot of these problems as much as he could, Why, if we transition now to talk a little bit about Element, because obviously you didn't play with him, and so I want to get your take on it, because actually, even though during the time you briefly were a journalist after your playing career, listen, that was a long time ago, and being a journalist back then meant you didn't have to write many articles, and they were just small write-ups, so it's nothing massive. It's not like later on in your career where you were a professional, but I think one of the best pieces you did was you did this kind of retrospective on Element's career when he retired. It wasn't actually his final retirement, because, if anything, that just shows what the guy was like, right? He didn't even retire properly. He retired, but one of his main retirements, right? I believe it was in 2007. And what you did was you did this really nice little profile where, because obviously you'd been someone who'd been in and around the scene, you kind of had insights into what he was doing, or what the right kind of rivalries behind the scenes were, or the friction that caused him to leave or join teams, such as you really elucidated for the first time the Executor Element beef that had happened, that had obviously been an issue. And in doing so, you had a really great line, I remember, at the end of it, where it was something along the lines of, not like Norway's prodigy, retired. And I think you put at the ripe old age of, I believe he's 19 or something ridiculous, something very, very, very young, where obviously he could have kept playing, he could have been fantastic. And in the story, you did a very good job of outlining his tumultuous career, which involved being a very good player, one of the greatest of all time, having, by the way, great accomplishments. Like, I believe he got something like, 4 or 5 world championships. But you also had a great line in it where you said something along the lines of, he won 4 or 5, but he actually probably underachieved, because his story was famously, even if he had a team, the best example being the SK team, who were literally basically unbeatable, winning every tournament, somehow he's one of those guys where he needed like a new challenge always. So in that case, he literally did go, leave the unbeatable team and join their rivals and then try and win with them, and then left that team win and join, he was a very weird guy. So how would you explain Element? Because what was it like as a player and as an outsider, but someone who was in the scene? What did he kind of make of his interesting path through his life?
Well, the first thing I can say is that since I wasn't on a team with him we were on the same team for 6 months at the very beginning. But at that point, I didn't see a problem with his personality and the way he behaved. I mean, he was a young kid. Okay, he was a young kid at that time. But all he wanted to do, he wanted to win. And he was like very committed to winning. And that was back in 2002. And this whole tumultuous path that you were referring to, that sort of happened after that, after he left Meredia to go to Game Online and then into SK and then over into Eolithic and then back into NOA, and then after that he went to MiBR and Four Kings and and Rival
Mouse Sports, all over the place, right?
Yeah. So well, the first thing about him was that he was sort of, at least in my eyes, the game's first prodigy. I mean, the first prodigious young guy to come up through the ranks, and we've seen a bunch since, right?
Just to clarify for people listening who don't realize, when we say a prodigy as well, we don't even just mean like the talent level was this ridiculous. He literally was like 15/16 when he was going to majors and going into the finals. So like literally, you can't get much more of a prodigy than that,
No, and he was on another level also at that age. Granted, the whole scene or the whole competitiveness of Counter-Strike and strats and all that, it wasn't too evolved. So you could, like, if you had natural talent and stuff like that, like he had in abundance, you could make a splash really as a really young guy. You didn't really have to learn too much before you were MVP level, and he was really MVP level, and he can change the course of a game for a team, not by putting up ridiculous amounts of frags, but by playing smart in a way that few people had seen up to that point. But then he had issues, I would say, fitting in with those teams, and since I didn't play in those teams, I couldn't say too much about it. But my impression of him is that he was a young guy, that he was so much better than most of the other people playing, and perhaps he was a bit impatient with it. Perhaps the other guys that he played with didn't, I don't know, respect or understand his mindset. And to be fair, he probably didn't understand his mindset himself at that time because he was so young. And we have to remember this. It's all a little too much too soon kind of thing, I think. And he was, since he also was kind of impulsive, he would go from one team to the next and into the next challenge. And because he was so good, he would always succeed in most of them, or at least for a time being, before he sort of dropped off and lost his passion to practice, and the rest of the world basically caught up. But yeah, he had issues with, that was kind of an interesting thing with the Norwegian scene, because he had this famous beef with Executor. And those guys, they can be civil, but I think they generally, on some level, at least inside of the game, they just get on each other's nerves. It's not even on purpose. They just sort of got on each other's nerves, and that was kind of the whole problem with that. And then he had this row with Knoxville also towards the end of Knoxville's career. Actually, I think it was Element who basically ended his career by saying that either he leaves or I leave. And then Knoxville left, and then they won 2 in a row, right? CPL Dallas 2004 and the first WEG season the next year. So he was a very impactful player, and he was sort of, from the outside, an erratic personality, but I always found him very nice and very respectful, and we have a good relationship to this day. Actually, we talk several times a month and sort of catch up and see where we are in life. So I think he has, granted, he did some stuff during his career that sort of gave him this reputation. But for people who know him, I think most people will just say that he's a genuinely nice guy.
Okay. So you alluded to it before, but your next journey was also another one abroad where you had this situation where you got an offer to come to the UK. And at the time in the UK, famously, the reason why Four Kings were the best team in the UK is, yes, they had some of the best players, but famously, they were the only ones who had proper sponsorship, basically. And part of the way they quite intelligently kind of played the scene was they had the main sponsorship. And then if anyone sort of started to challenge them, they would always pick, the right star player to steal that would like both make you strong still, but also kind of cripple the opponent. And so no one ever expected there to actually be a second team in the UK that was good. But there was this situation where PC Gamer, the big games magazine, put together some sort of a bizarre PR stunt where it was like they were going to make their own team that they would somehow sponsor. I assume the publishing house behind it is the one really doing it, but they were going to sponsor it. And the idea was, it would attend qualifiers, and if it qualified, it would go to big tournaments like CPLs, etc. And so they brought you in to be the captain. I mean, understandable if you've listened to the story so far. You've been in lots of different countries. Obviously, you went over to Brazil. And at the time, this is the part that I don't think people probably don't understand. Is people will probably think, haha, UKCS, because especially now it's considered a joke, and they'll think, no wonder it failed. It wasn't your fault, BSL. But this team actually had some talented players in it, right? And the UK scene at the time did have some good players. They just lacked things like leaders. Obviously, they didn't have sponsors. So what do you think? What was the disconnect there? What was the problem? And why couldn't you make this experiment work?
Well, the problem with that team was mentality. It wasn't talent. They had several very talented players. One guy, his handle, I think, was Duck. He was very good. And there was this other guy. His name was Shaq, I think. He was also very good. British players, really talented and really, really good. But the team didn't have the mentality to keep improving. It's kind of difficult to explain, but when you sort of in-game lead a team, or when you captain a team, you have to make sure, or back then at least, because there were no coaches, obviously, so you had to basically coach the team as well. And when you go to these places where there is no culture for performance, I mean, I came from Norwegian culture of performance within Counter-Strike, because we had a massive attack. We had players and teams that had been to the highest level and sort of understood what it takes, because most fans will say that, okay, this guy can shoot, he's a world-class player, but it's not about that. Trust me, at the highest level, everybody can hit their shots. It's more about calm under pressure, teammate skills, communication, and the mentality to win. These are intangibles. They're not that easy to sort of measure. So it's difficult. And in the British team, we had all of the skills that we needed. But these guys, they responded, they didn't respond well to the way I was leading them, and the way I was bugging them about mistakes. And my point of view has always been, when I'm in a team, I want to win. This was kind of like the case with Element as well. So you have to sort of raise issues when there are mistakes, right? Because the important thing is you have to have the guts to try stuff and to fail. But if you fail by doing something stupid, you also have to have the vision to sort of say, okay, that was stupid. I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to do something different. And this was kind of the attitude and the mentality that I wasn't able to implement in that team, because they would just get pissed off and shut down mentally and communication wise when I was trying to get them to understand that if you do A, then B will happen, and B means we lose, right? So that was kind of the first time I ran into that issue, because I had captainship of a Norwegian team, a Brazilian team, and a North American team, and we had all sort of found ways to work. But with the British team, we just couldn't find that common ground where everybody was on the same page, and sort of, I think they felt like I was insulting them or something, which was never my intention. I only tried to address mistakes so that we would get better. But in the end, it didn't work out, and I left more or less that summer. And as I remember, they got someone else. I can't remember who they got. I think they got a Swedish guy, but the team sort of went under not too long after. So unfortunately, that was sort of like a failure. And at that point, in the fall of 2004, I thought that I was done in esports, because obviously I got kicked out of the second best team in the world after having the best placement of my career and also playing well. And then I failed at a lower level at getting them up and get better. So I thought that I was done, that I had been through my career arc, so to speak. But luckily I was wrong.
Okay, so obviously now we lead into, you come back to Norway, you make this Team Catch Gamer, which was a popular portal website. I mean, these terms don't really exist anymore, but people can get a sense of what it is. Kind of the HLTV.org of Norway. That's about the closest you can come, but with like a membership, kind of mixed with the ESEA then. There we go. There's the analogy for you. So when you made this team, right, later on, you got some world-class Norwegian players, some very good Norwegian players, but when you first made the team, right, you had some players who were good, like obviously Juvenal was already an established player, Day had been around, but generally this was initially a team where you were kind of looking to bring some of the newer talents forwards. And I know someone you have always referenced, and no one else is going to know him, he's actually a very, very unknown player, unfortunately, was someone called Jazam, who had been around like semi-pro level, and this was kind of his only big chance actually in a big team. And obviously this particular version of the lineup didn't really have great results, they just had some okay runs, you know. Why do you always list that guy as like put it this way, in your career you list him alongside, you know, like Real and like fantastically talented players who were like all-time greats. So why did this guy never really get his chance to shine in the same way so we'd all know his name?
Well, Jazam, the reason why I always list him is because I think I have enough data on it. I mean, with Catch Gamer, we played that year, I think we played 7 or 8 international tournaments, and we placed in the top 3, I think, or the top 5 of all of them. And in all of them, he was our best player, and he would do like amazing stuff that I had never seen anybody do. And this was 2005, where the general level of Counter-Strike had gone through the roof. I mean, you remember the early days where you had NIP, and you might have a Norwegian team, and you might have one American team and possibly a German team. But at this point, it was sort of like today, where 10 teams can win any tournament, right? So he was doing these amazing things, and he was also a very team-oriented player. So he wasn't really bragging. I mean, if he had a Twitter account, he wouldn't be bragging about it. And more than his job, and was phenomenally skilled and smart player, even though he played with an inverted mouse, which was completely, in my mind, mind-blowing that he could play on that level with like a flight simulator attitude. But anyway, no, he was really, really good.
Okay, because I feel like the team, obviously I can't technically know what you're going to say now, but if I had to guess, the next lineup of Catch Gamer, where you basically what happened, a quick version for people in history, okay, is at the time there was 2 Norwegian teams, and both were good in different ways. There was Team Catch Gamer, which was this lineup we're talking about, and then there was this young team that rose up on their own merits entirely, which is called Team 9, famously taking up the Swedish cafe name, you know, but didn't have to go to many tournaments. And this was a squad where they were all just a little core of players that had known each other. And most famously, we had kind of the second Norwegian prodigy. We had a player called Real, who also, as a 15-year-old, was good enough to like win events, be the MVP, you know. But the problem was this team didn't have a very good sponsorship situation. And at the end of the year we're referring to, they split in half basically, and 2 of them came to join you, Oops and Real, who were 2 of the better players, and then the other half went to this bizarre NOA team where they were like half Norwegian and half Danish with Executor. So, well, that's a side topic. We don't need to address that. I don't know why that was ever attempted, but okay. You know, I mean, I realized Denmark and Norway were at one point in time the same country, but that was a long time ago, Executor. It doesn't work. So anyway, when you got Real and Oops into this team, I remember, because as we talked already, like the team was decent enough before, but Real was like a legit, you know, potential best player in the world type candidate. You had real firepower now, people who were already complete players. You went to some events. Obviously, you had like a pretty decent result at the WEG Masters tournament, but ultimately, I mean, I'm going to guess the team are underwhelmed for what you thought they should have accomplished, right? This was a chance to potentially be a great team, right?
Well, first of all, I mean, the first lineup that we had in Catch Gamer, the 2005 lineup, it was a completely different base team. I mean, I see some of the analysis that the best writers and stuff around the scene make today about role players and whatnot. We weren't using those terms back then, but in the Catch Gamer team, it was more of like a workhorse team where we had 4 or 5 guys basically on the same level, Juzam being the only one who could really shine. And we had to sort of do our strats around that, and we became really successful because we managed to incorporate team play as a way of winning. And the first tournament that we went to in Sweden, we lost to this famous Swedish mixed team that would go to all these BYOC tournaments in Sweden. I don't know if you remember Skolpojkarna.
Yeah, schoolboys.
Yeah, and that was really embarrassing. But the next tournament we flew to was CPL Istanbul, because this was the year of the CPL World Tour. Yes. And not a lot of top teams went there, except for Virtus Pro, which was the emerging Russian team who had beaten SK famously at ESWC, and they were really good. And we had a huge matchup with them in the semifinals that we won in triple overtime or something. And then we won that event, went to CPL Barcelona, placed 5th, and then we got invited to WEG Season 2, where we placed 2nd, and that's where we beat Four Kings, which had Element in their lineup, and a lot of other top teams, and we would lose in the final to a team called Begrip that nobody had heard about. But these guys, you need to understand that these guys, they had 3 players that have put their mark down on Counter-Strike history. It was just their emerging team. So they had Tentpole, and they had Robban, and they had Forest. So these guys were this was their coming out party, that tournament. And they just blasted everybody. And they were new generation players, and they were in a whole different level. And at that point, I sort of understood that, okay, we probably need to switch some stuff up. And we got Nikon into the team. Nikon was probably the second best player I ever played with. Always very smart and stable, and also a very good team player. And towards the end of the year, we had to get rid of Juzam and Zevi, which was another teammate that I liked a lot, because these guys were just playing World of Warcraft around the clock. That was why we had to get rid of them. And I was imploring with them to sort of stay on course and practice, because we were at probably top 5 level in the world throughout that year. And that takes a lot of practice, right? And also these guys at Catch Gamer, they had this huge investment in our team. I mean, we had a budget for that year for 2005, which was around 50,000 euros for travel for the 5 of us. That's a huge budget. Yeah. So the investment was large, and I felt like really strongly that we had to honor that investment. And these guys, they sort of drifted off into Azeroth and were never seen or heard from, and I had to let them go, and that's where we picked up Real and Oops, and these were new school players, sort of in the same fit from the same mold as Robban and Forest at that time. So they were on a whole different level aim wise, and while Oops was really good, I mean, he wasn't. I mean, there were some personality issues there and some immaturity and stuff. Even though he was 3 or 4 years older than Real, but Real was a real superstar there. He was. I mean, I say that Jusam is the best player I've ever played with, and that's true. But Real is the best player I have ever seen. And he was sort of like a new school Element. I mean, they had sort of similar career paths, even though their personalities aren't the same. But it was the same thing. Really, really young, extremely good, and he just couldn't. He didn't find a way to have the career that suited his skills, to say it that way. But going forward, in 2006, we got invited to the tournament in China and got placed in a group with, I think, 4K and then WNV, who had won the previous season, which was a star Chinese team, and SK. So it was like the group of death, basically. But we came through that, and then we underperformed in the semifinals, where we lost against Complexity. And then I think the steam ran out of the team, and we lost the 4th place match against Solo and the Korean team as well. But that was where we had the sort of the most skilled lineup that we had in that team.
So why did that team kind of fizzle out after that? Because you went to the tournaments, it continued on, but it never reached these heights that you would hope it would.
No. I mean, the biggest thing that we actually achieved was beating SK 16-0, and it's sort of lionized in Norway, that game. Yeah. And as well it should, because it was the first time like a huge top team beat another top team by those margins, and they were the reigning world champions. They had won the CPL, previous CPL and everything, so it was completely unheard of, and that sort of showed the potential that was in the team. But unfortunately, we weren't able to tap into it, and I don't really know why that happened. It might have been something with the composition in the team. We went to Dreamhack after WG Masters, and we didn't do well there, even though we beat SK again. But we crashed out against some Swedish team, can't remember who. And then we made one final attempt, having a week-long boot camp before we were set to go off to Dallas for the summer event. And then we lost. We're sent down into the lower bracket by Alternate Attacks, which at that point had their famous lineup, and they were the second or third best team in the world at that point. But we lost to them in a close match, and then that was it. We lost the next match as well and finished 32-67 or something ridiculous. Yeah. And at that point, I said that okay, we can't keep doing this. We need to switch some stuff up, and I suggested that we switch out Oops to put PRB in there with me, Nikon, and Juvenile and Element. No, I'm sorry, Real. And everybody agreed. And then I think Real and Juvenile had second thoughts, so they wanted to play with Oops and PRB. And then basically me and Nikon were left hanging. And I suspect that, if Lars Nikon had wanted, he could probably have gone with them. But to his credit, he didn't sort of say that. So we sort of just quit, both of us. And it wasn't a really good way to end the career, like coming off like a terrible loss in Dallas. But I mean, it is what it is. It's esports. I had been able to travel the world for 6 years doing something that I love and have so many great adventures. And at that point, they offered me to rebuild Catch Gamer, a lot of money to do that. But I said that, okay, you need to get someone else, because I don't think I have the motivation to go into rebuilding mode again. As you pointed out, I've had several rebuilding endeavors over the course of my career. So I was just tired. I was also 26 years old, and I was like, I need to figure out if I'm going to do something different with my life. And I couldn't sit in front of the computer and practice 8 hours a day, which is required to perform at that level. So yeah, it ended on that note. But I mean, it is what it is. I had a great career and so many cool adventures with it. So I mean, I was happy regardless.
One of the things that I know people in the Norwegian scene actually love me for is that I've done so many pieces over the years, which are along the lines of like bringing out some of these stories of players that, you know, maybe didn't make it on the top level. And obviously, like I did a video on this, I think it was last year, where I got so annoyed that whenever people talked about Norwegian CS, because obviously like Swedish and Danish CS have done incredible things over the years. And then Finland in their own way have, but obviously they've obviously had the military thing limiting them to some degree. And then they're just Finns. So they're obviously weird.
Hey, they have Lurpis.
They do.
They have living legend.
but the problem is, people, I remember I saw loads of comments, even from people from Norway who were like, Norwegian CS never did anything. They were all just trash and, you know, we just didn't have good players. And I would always be like, bullshit. Like, absolutely. They had, like, listen, maybe no one's like Sweden, because at the time Sweden was ridiculous. But Norway was definitely up there with like Denmark, etc. And could, if things had gone the right way, perhaps have been one of the truly great nations and had, you know, its entire teams could have been top placing in majors, etc., like these other countries did. But when you look at it, it's kind of logical that it didn't happen, because when you look at some of the best players from this region, and you look at Real and Element, I mean, these are the players you need as kind of your horses if you're going to go to win these majors, you know. When you look at people like Knoxville, etc., and some of the ridiculous, like I say, soap opera, like cut this one guy and then 2 months later he's playing in your team again. When you look at all these things here, was the scene just too immature? What held back the Norwegian scene?
Yeah, I think you're right on the button there about immaturity. The scene had a lot of problems with immaturity, and it had that later also. I think that Norway essentially was Denmark. As we know Denmark today, right? I mean, obviously today you could argue that Denmark has the better teams, but in my mind, at least, Sweden will always be the best esports team in Scandinavia because of their history.
Yes.
And way back when Norway was well, we weren't on level with the Swedes, but we were certainly above Denmark, and nobody really took Finland seriously back then because they were all cheating and doing strange stuff with their config.
Playing on clan base with configs. Yes, you're right.
up until the point where Natu and Lurpis started to get into like real teams and build some stuff over there. I mean, granted, obviously they have a huge legacy as well, but in the early days, at least, there were a lot of strange players coming out of Finland who never came to LAN tournaments. But anyway, with the Norwegian scene, everything sort of just. Well, I quit in 2006, right? And then these guys, Real, Juvenile, Oops, and also Element, they played on for a couple of years. They had some good results, but what did not happen was they could never foster a new generation of talent to be equally good as their generation or my generation was. So we sort of didn't resupply, if you understand what I'm saying. We couldn't resupply, and well, from my mind, at least, I think that has to do with immaturity. I played a lot of mixed games back then, and at least in Norway, we had this whole thing where everybody wanted to be a superstar in those practice matches and not learn from the pros. And when you get that mentality, you're never ever going to make it on top level unless you're Real and Element. And those guys, they come around every blue moon, right? Yeah. So you have to might sound strange, but you have to respect your elders. You have to learn from the best players, because experience, communication, team play skills, those things matter on the top level. It might not matter that much on tier 2 or 3 or 4 or wherever you are, but when you get up to the highest level, that's what differentiates a winning team from a team that's not winning. So we couldn't resupply our talent pool well enough, and obviously, that's a fault of some of the elders, probably like myself, even though I feel I brought some people along. Day, for instance, I took Day into Catch Gamer and helped resupply that, and also tried to help educate the younger players. But at one point, when I stopped playing a lot of mix and pickup games online, I think this whole sort of thing with Norway sort of petered out. We couldn't get new players up there, and it's sort of the whole scene sort of collapsed. And that was at the same time as the credit crunch happened, and they started getting problems funding esports, and there were some bad dark years there, and we've never really gotten back to our feet. Obviously now we have Rain, which is one of the best players in the world, and I'm hoping that he and Rubino and some of the other players who are playing on a world level can help bring along younger players. So because I sort of feel that Norway needs to get their place again among the best Counter-Strike nations in the world. I feel it's our history and that we should be up there with Sweden and Denmark. And I've been listening to Swedish and Danish people, I mean, esports professionals now, and it's inspiring to see how much they've been able to do with Counter-Strike in their countries and with esports and gaming in general, not just with teams, but I mean, in terms of schools and in terms of academy teams and etc. And I think that we need to get there in Norway as well.
So even though technically you were retired, there's this bizarre scenario where you had to, like, it's literally like that, one of those shit storylines from a movie, you know, where they come in on the chopper and they got the guy in the wood cabin and you got to come back for one last mission, you know, because you went to a tournament. It was one of the eStars Seoul events. It was in Seoul in Korea, and you were there to be a commentator and got frag, etc. You were retired, but MiBR had a player who a few people might know called FNX, and believe it or not, when he was young, he was a little bit difficult. He was a little bit tricky to deal with. You know, you wouldn't believe it, would you? But so for whatever reason, he didn't board a plane to this tournament, and so they thought to themselves, that BSL guy used to play in this team, admittedly about 4 years earlier, but, you know, he used to play in this team, and they just basically said, please play for this team. But what people don't know is, you actually did all right. Like, you actually, won maps off the good teams, and you did pretty decently for a guy coming out of retirement, right?
Yeah, I was kind of happy with myself at that tournament, but it was, like you say, it was out of a bad movie. I was there reporting on and covering the tournament for Godfrag, and then I'm literally sitting in my hotel room in Seoul and writing something, and then there's a knock on my door, and I open the door, and there's Kogu, the Brazilian legend Kogu, who was the captain of MiBR at this point. And you've got to remember, this was in 2007. That's the summer after Brazil had its first world championship
It was
with
the year
MiBR.
after, yeah, they won in 2006. Yeah.
So they were top level guys and invited for this tournament. And Kogu's there and he's smiling and says, "So Jonas, do you want to play?" And I'm like, "What?" And he tells me the whole story about FNX not boarding the plane for whatever reason, and essentially they're desperate, right? Because they didn't have a reserve player with them. They didn't even have a manager who could play. So they had asked the tournament organizers if they could put me in there, and they were good to go. The only thing that was left was for me to say yes. So I asked Gottfried if they thought it was okay that I'd practice with MiBR and play in the tournament, and they said, yeah, that's certainly going to be a unique way of writing about the tournament. So off we went into the practice areas, and I hadn't played a lot of Counter-Strike for 5 or 6 months, I think, and certainly not on a top world-class level, because this is a really upper echelon of players, right? And it had changed somewhat from when I played the year before, because this whole duck jump thing had been discovered and incorporated into everybody's playstyle. So I remember holding an angle there while we were practicing, and like I had the crosshair tight at the corner, and then this guy came duck jumping out, and I missed with about 3 or 4 meters, and he killed me instantly. And I thought, this is going to be a very, very long and bad tournament. But after some hours, I sort of adjusted and moved my crosshairs a little bit and sort of got into it. And when the tournament came around and we played on stage and stuff like that, it was fine. I mean, I play off experience, and what you need to understand also is there is a certain way of playing in competition that is different from how you play in practice. And I was always more comfortable with the way you play in tournaments than I was with the way you play in practice. So after I sort of discovered this in my career, I started playing better and better at tournaments and worse in practice, I guess. So I was fine, and we actually took a map off Fnatic, which had their one of their famous lineups. So at least Forest was in there, and that was a huge thing. So after that tournament, they actually called me and asked me if I wanted to go back to Brazil and coach them full time, and I said that. That's going to be difficult for me at this point, and I basically turned them down because I had real life obligations and all of that. But it was a very, I don't know, interesting last hurrah for me as a player, if you understand what I'm saying, because I crashed out at like 40th place in CPL, and then I could get top 3 at a world class tournament with my MiBR guys, because they are my MiBR guys, and Brazilian CS has always had a special place in my heart. So that was really cool.
So after this, not only had you done some esports journalism, but your actual job became journalist. You worked for like a big Norwegian newspaper. I even remember seeing, like, here's the thing, right? Somehow, if there's news out there about anything to do with it gets to me, BSL. I don't even need to find it nowadays. It just comes towards me, it's like magnetically drawn. So I remember over the years, I even saw like you'd won some award, for journalism. So one of the last moments before you joined ESL now was the first major in CSGO was Dreamhack Winter 2013. So it was at end of November, and you were selected as the host of this, and you had me there. I was there. I was the analyst. Believe it or not, for everyone, the other analyst was actually Sir Scoots. And by the way, that doesn't mean Sir Scoots used to be super in the game, was analysing it all. He was absolutely going by the seat of his pants, and he just, there wasn't many people to do it at that point. It was the first event, to be fair, that we had as a major. So at that, right, when you did that tournament, listen, you turned up, you looked very slick, you had the professionalism down, you were killing the on-camera presence, right? And I thought, because of all the time you were a journalist, it's all going to go really well. And I thought, right, maybe he's going to be he's going to do half and half. He's going to do CS events, he's going to do stuff. What happened at this major? Like, why was this like a one and done for you, and then we haven't seen you in esports for a while?
Well, I was doing some events, some WCGs as a commentator, but I was essentially out of esports for 3 or 4 years. And then DreamHack asked me to host this desk at their first major event. I didn't even know what a major was at that point, because I wasn't really paying that much attention to the scene. And they asked me if I could host, probably because I had background as a journalist. I mean, like a news journalist.
Yes.
And I said, hey, that's cool. I would love to get involved in esports again. Sounds great. So I sort of I found all of the appropriate sites and all the information I had to read, etc., to sort of prepare for this gig. But what happened was kind of how my real life job conflicted with this whole dream of esports, because the week before, when I was supposed to do all my prep work, I was sent to the Philippines by my newspaper. There had been a natural disaster there, wiped out huge amounts of people and areas of the country, and I was sent there because there was a Norwegian guy who was running an orphanage, and he was sort of lost in the disaster area, and the newspaper wanted me to go in there and try and find him and get an interview with him. So needless to say, that was a very, very crazy week with absolutely no sleep, lots of I guess bad visual impressions, if you could say it neutrally like that. And it was a really successful work week in that we managed to interview him. Our stories were sold to all the big networks, Norwegian networks, and we basically got there first. But I had to go straight from there, back home, switch clothes, have a shower, and then go to Dreamhack. So in my own estimation, I didn't do very well as a desk host there. I'm not going to make too many apologies, just as to say that I had my prep work lined up, but other things conflicted with that. And I think it's fair. They didn't ask me to come back and host again. And like I said, I think that's fair. I'm used to, performance-based lifestyle, both in Counter-Strike and in news journalism. And I didn't have any hard feelings, except that I obviously felt like I missed my chance to go back into esports and have fun with it. But it was fair. I didn't do a very good job, but at least the major was a success from what I can see. There were a lot of people watching, and it sort of started to get the ball rolling again. So in that sense, I guess it was fun to be a part of it. But for my own performance level, I wasn't really satisfied with that.
Okay, right. As kind of a closing topic, I wanted to ask you this. Okay, so throughout your career, when people hear like getting kicked and then having to go to all these different weird projects, and admittedly, it's not like the scene back home was great. It's not like you were locked out in that way. But I have to say, especially in 1.6, it was very rare that fans and even some of the players actually really respected in-game leaders much. Like even a lot of star players used to think to themselves like, well, yeah, someone has to do that job and I don't want to do it. But, I just shoot people in the head and he roughly tells the others what to do. A lot of people really thought that way. And I don't think it's actually until the last couple of years that we kind of actually have this mystique that's now attached to great captains, where actually you can be a captain now who doesn't frag very well and perhaps individually isn't even very good, but people understand the impact that you might have on a team. Like you might be some tactical wizard, or perhaps you're great at man management or whatever it might be, managing egos, etc. Do you feel like in your career you never really got kind of your due, your respect? Did you get it from the scene, do you think?
Well, I think I got a lot of stuff out of esports. I mean, essentially my whole career in journalism came off of what I learned in esports, how to perform and how to build a culture around those kinds of things. So I'm not going to sulk about that. I had some good performances. I ran some teams. I played 2 finals of the most difficult tournaments at that time. And I think it's kind of split down the middle with me. I mean, you really, really like me and you respect the work that I did in Brazil and with NOA and with all these different teams and communities all around the world, or you think I'm shit because I was a bad aimer and I also tended to be overly direct in my communication, especially against online players. I'm not gonna lie. I wasn't very polite at all times. So it's kind of split down the middle. Fans either hate me or love me, and I guess that's fine because that's the way I handle myself and all of that. But I do think it's really, really cool that sort of the mystique around the captain or the in-game leader role is coming back to Counter-Strike, because I think the game needs it. It adds a layer of interest that's not there if you have 5 guys just running around shooting and having a coach standing and telling them where to go, and I know how difficult it is. So I am profoundly impressed to see how well the captains of today are doing it. Obviously, with my new job, I'm not really, I can't really be a fan of any one team, but it's really interesting to me to see how the best captains today handle their role. and they're really, really, really good. And now they're good individually as well, which back then,
Sure.
to be fair, we weren't really on that level, even though we tried.
Okay, so obviously people will have heard you came back to ESL, but I mean, when you're outside of ESL, it is just this shadowy, massive metropolis almost that no one knows what goes on, who does what. It's just ESL. It's just the three letters, right? So what do you actually do at ESL, and in what way does it interact with Counter-Strike potentially? What can you tell us?
Well, my job title is Global Tournament Director, and that means that I go around to all our different tournaments and make sure that they run fine and that they get better from one point to another. And that's basically all I can say about it. I also try and engage with the community and be outspoken and reach out in that sense. And basically, my job is just to interact with the fans, community, the players, the teams, the organizations, and everything to make sure that our tournaments get better and better with each outing. And I have had New York under my belt right now. It's obviously a lot of new stuff for me coming back in 2017. And now I did Hamburg for Dota 2, which was very, very interesting. And now we're going into Oakland and the Pro League finals in Odense. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to interacting more with the scene and the crowds and everything again. And it's spectacular how big it has gotten with all of these arenas and all of that stuff. I'm still pinching me and get goosebumps every time I hear the crowds roar for the players.
Okay, at the end of the interview, do you have a final message or something you need to thank or say hello to?
Well, I just want to thank everybody who's a fan of esports and who's had this dream of esports and who has sort of stuck with it. Like yourself, for instance, I remember meeting you in the basement of CPL Dallas in 2001, and you were just this young kid running around with your recorder, trying to make stories and do pictures of teams and put them up on sites so people could read about this whole thing around the world. And it's people like yourself and all the other people who have been behind the scenes throughout all these years, and the fans who've made this thing into what it is today. And that's something that I really appreciate, because I've sort of warped from the scene and into something else, and then back into the scene with all of you guys have been here throughout this whole thing. And I think that's really cool, and something all of you should sort of, I guess, it's something that you can take with you for the rest of your life, right? You help build this thing. So that's really great for everyone who's been involved in that.
Tusen takk.
But hyggelig.
He's definitely brutal, he's always savage, and you're definitely getting wrecked.